Hello, welcome to another video. In my first video on writing SFTP clients in Java, I used a library called jsch. jsch does what it claims, but it does feel a little bit dated. The library that I'm going to show you today is called SSHJ, and it has a slightly more modern feel to it. There are a few other advantages to using it. I'll cover those advantages in the video description down below. So let's get right to it. Before we can use the library, we of course need to add the dependency to our build tool. So in my case, I'm using Gradle, so we need to edit build.gradle. So let's have a look at our build.gradle. And here is the library dependency. Okay. So before we get to writing code, I just want to talk a little bit about the setup that I have here. So on the right hand side here, you can see that I have a Linux machine running. So this Linux machine is running in VirtualBox. And inside this Linux machine, there is an SFTP server running, and it's exposing this particular directory to the user1. Okay, the IP address of this SFTP server of this machine is 192.168.56.102. Okay, so now that I've explained the configuration, the setup that we have here, now let's try to connect to this SFTP server using Java. So what I've done before this video started is that I created a few IntelliJ live templates. So these IntelliJ live templates, they're basically code snippets to help me explain this library, and I make these templates available in the video description down below, so that you can use it. You can use the snippets in your own code. So the first snippet that I prepared is for connecting to an SFTP server. Okay, so this is the snippet that I have here is SSHJ connect. Okay, so this is the code that you need to use to connect to an SFTP server using using the SSHJ library. So you need to fill in the IP address of, or the host name of the SFTP server that you want to connect to. So in my case, it's 192.168.56.102. Okay. All right. So after the connection is done, then we can do all our SSH and SFTP interactions here. And then when we're done, we can disconnect. So now let's run the code. Okay, and we're getting an error here, and the error that we're getting is that it could not verify the host key. All right, and the reason it could not verify the host key is because in the snippet here, I have it loading the global known host file, right? That means the known host file in the .ssh directory of my user account, right? So this particular host file, this particular known host file, it does not have the public key of this server that I'm connecting to, right? So let's fix that right now. Let's create a host file, a known host file that includes the SSH public key of the server on the right-hand side here, okay? So we'll do that by just doing SSH -o host key algorithms. And in this case, we see that the algorithm that SSHJ is expecting is this SSH ED25519, right? So let's specify that algorithm here. And let's create a host key file, known host file, just for this project, rather than change our global one. So let's do -o user known host file is equal to host.dat. And in order to, we need to initiate a connection so that SSH will confirm us to confirm the fingerprint. And once we confirm the fingerprint, SSH will generate the host file for us. Sorry, the known host file for us. Okay, so user1 at 192.168.56.102. Okay, so it's asking us here to confirm whether this is the actual fingerprint of the server that we want to connect to. So in the correct thing to do here is, of course, to verify that this fingerprint is correct. But in my case, I'm just going to click yes. Okay, so we can skip this authentication part because what we just want to do is we just want to create the host file, I mean, the known host file, right? We don't care about authentication at this point. So let's cancel that. And once that's done, the host file should be created here. Yeah, so now you can see there's a host file here, right? Okay, so now that known host file called host.dat in my current directory here contains the public key of the server that I want to connect to. Okay, so now that we've done that, we also need to update our code here so that it is loading that host file, that known host file in my current directory instead of the global known host file. Okay, so let's do that. And now let's see whether it works. Okay, so now it's exiting without any error, right? So let's say for whatever reason you prefer to use RSA as your host key algorithm. Um, you can do that by just customizing the SSH client configuration. So let's have a look at the code for doing that. Okay, so let's now run the code again, and we should be getting an error. Yep, so we're getting an error again, and this time it says it's the same error that we got the first time we tried connecting to the server. And the reason we're getting this error is because our host.dat file does not contain the RSA public key of the server that we're connecting to, right? It only contains the SSH ed25519 key, right? So let's delete this particular key and let's initiate a connection to the SFTP server again, but this time let's request the RSA public key of the server. Okay, so of course, in the correct way to do it is that you should verify that this fingerprint is correct, and only then type yes. And we don't need to worry about authentication at this point. Okay, so now our host file. Let's close this and we open it again. Host file. So now the host file contains the RSA public key of our SFTP server. Okay, so now let's run the program again, and this time we should not be getting an error. Okay, great. So now we have successfully connected to the server, but we have not authenticated yet. So there are two ways to authenticate. One is using password-based authentication, and the other is using key-based authentication. So let's cover password-based authentication first. Okay, so I've prepared a snippet for this as well. And my username is user1, and the password that for user1 is this. And just to verify that authentication worked, let's just print out the value for is authenticated. Okay, and now let's run the program again. Yep, so we're getting true because the user successfully authenticated. So that's one way to authenticate using username and password, but we can also authenticate using private keys, right? Using key pairs. So I've already prepared a key for user1 here, and I've already added it to the SFTP server. I've already configured it on the SFTP server. So here is the key right here, right? And if you recall, in jsch, this particular format of private keys isn't supported. So that's one good thing about SSHJ. It supports this, the native OpenSSH private key format, okay, out of the box. For JSCH, you need to use a fork of JSCH to get this feature, okay? So let's try that out. So SSHJ auth public key, okay? So you need to specify the username again, user1. And in this case, instead of specifying the password, right, the argument, the second argument here is the path to the private key, right? So it's in keys and then user1 OPENSSH, right? So that's the location where my private key is at. Okay. So now let's run the program again, and it should be authenticated. Yeah, so it returns true. So now that we have authenticated to the server, we can finally create our SFTP client object. So there are two types of SFTP clients available, the default and the stateful client. So the difference between these two is that the stateful client keeps track of the current working directory. Okay, so in the code from here on, we're going to be using the stateful client, okay, so that it keeps track of the current directory that we're in. So let's create a stateful client. Okay. So this will create the client, and any SFTP code should be in between these two curly braces. Okay. So just to verify that things are working, let's print out the contents, the list of items in the current directory. Okay, so let's do that. Okay. So what this does is that we're listing the items in the current directory. Then for each of the items, we're printing out, if the item is a directory, we print out dir followed by the directory name. And if for everything else, we just print out the name. Okay. So let's try running that. So when we run this, we should see the program list down all these entries in the console. Okay, so we should see those same directory entries. Yep. So you see that there are 4 directories and there's 1 file. Okay. So you can see here that there is a directory files to process. So let's enter this directory and let's list down the files in that directory. Okay. So let's just add a line of code for changing the directory. So SFTP client cd, and we want to go into the files to process directory. And let's run the program again. So let's see contents of that directory. And we should see data.txt, input.csv, and people.csv. Okay, there. So you can see that there's a file here called input.csv, right? So let's try downloading this file. Okay, so let's try downloading this file. Okay, let's delete this code first. And let's download this file to a directory. So let's download this file to a directory called downloaded. Okay, so I've already created this directory in advance called downloaded. So let's download this input.csv file to that directory. So SSHJ, SFTP, get to file. Okay, so the first argument here is the name of the remote file that we want to download. So input.csv. And the second argument here is the location on our local computer where we want to save that file to. So I should use the tab here. So in this case, it's downloaded, and we want to give it the name input.csv. Okay, so now let's run the program again. And when we run the program, we should see a file created in this directory. Okay, so let's have a look. And as you can see, there's an input.csv file here. Sometimes we prefer to download the file to a buffer instead of a file so that we can process it immediately in memory, right? So let's do that right now. So let's delete this and let's do SSHJ. We get to buffer. Okay, so the file that we want to download is the same file, input.csv. And in this case, instead of saving to a file, we create an input stream to the remote file, and we read all the bytes, we convert it to a string, and then we print it to the console. So let's run this code now. And the output should be the same. Yep. So the output is the same. Okay. So that covers downloading content. Now let's cover uploading content. So before we upload a file, let's create a directory for storing our uploaded file. So in this case, it would be a directory on the SFTP server. Okay. So let's create a directory in this, a subdirectory of this directory. Okay. So let's do SFTP client, SFTP client.mkdir, and let's call the directory files from SSHJ. Okay. And after we create that directory, let's enter that directory. Okay, now let's run the program. And we should see that there's a new directory here. Okay. Okay, there's a directory. There's a directory that we created. Okay. So now that we've created that directory, let's upload files to that directory. So I've already prepared a file here to upload.txt. So here's the file. So let's upload this file to this directory. So I've already prepared a snippet for this. Sorry, SSHJ put from file. So the first argument here would be the location of the file that we want to upload, right? So in this case, it would be upload to upload.txt. And the second argument here would be the destination on the SFTP server. So let's just save it to the current directory in a file called toupload.txt. And now let's run it. Okay, so now there should be a file here. Okay, so we're getting an error here because we're attempting to create a directory that already exists, right? Because we already created the directory files from SSHJ. So if we mkdir that again, mkdir will throw an error. So the easy fix for this is to use mkdirs instead of mkdir. So mkdirs is actually for creating a whole tree of directories, but you can also use it as a way to only create a directory if it doesn't exist, since it will not throw an error if the directory that you are attempting to create already exists. So now let's try again. And now the file exists on the server. Finally, let's look at how we can upload from a string or an in-memory buffer to a file on the server. Okay, so let's do that. Let's delete this line of code first. And let's use a snippet that I prepared. So SSHJ, SFTP put from string, right? And the first argument here to SFTP client.open is the path to the file that we want to create on the server. So let's create the file in this directory, and let's call it from buffer.txt. Okay, right? And the second thing that we need to do is we need to specify the string or the buffer that we want to actually upload to the server, right? So in this case, we just want to upload a string, and let's just upload a string of A, B, C, D, E, F. Okay. So now let me just explain what this code does. So in this case, we're opening the file for writing, right? On the server, we're opening the file for writing, and we will create the file if it doesn't exist. That's what this create does, okay? And we're creating an output stream because we want to send data to the server. We have to create an output stream to the file, and we're just writing the string A, B, C, D, E, F to that output stream, okay? So when we run this program, we should see a new file here called from buffer.txt. Okay, so there you can see that the file was created, and when you open it, you see abcde.f. So that's pretty much what I wanted to cover in this video. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment down below. Thank you.